Hello everyone, my name is Ben Frank. Welcome everybody to our call. I hear some people, so I need to mute some of you, so please mute yourself if you are not on mute. And yes, now it's better, so let's try again. Welcome everyone, my name is Ben Frank. I'm here in Prague. This is Prague, almost live, but it kind of looks like this right now. We have kind of gray winter here. But today you are coming from all over the world to join us on our next community management talk, which we do for you, with you, and about the art of community management and community leadership. We do this every month. We do this for the GVGs and the members of the community groups program. So welcome GVGs, welcome developer communities, welcome all those people who are watching us now. Our biggest guest today is Jono Bacon. Jono, actually, I met him, I'm almost tempted to say, in a bed in my hotel about 5 years ago, on the Kindle, where I was reading his book, The Art of Community Management. So, Jono, you didn't know, but we have met a long time ago. I've also met Jono more in person since last summer. He's been actually helping us with some of our community matters. So some of the things actually that have been taking place in the GVG and communities programs in Google. So Jono has been helping us with that. And the main expertise that we tap into with Jono's is the art of community leadership. Jono has a ton of experience on his back. He has been former community director at Ubuntu, at GitHub. He's been consulting a ton of companies. Like most of them, I don't even think like you are allowed to say their names, Jono, but trust me, he has done that. And I felt like his insights to be like pretty sharp. Like sometimes he's going in like with those like heavy metal guitars behind him, and I like that. You know, that means like you are like keeping like different perspective. So let's use Jono's time with us today and ask him anything about the community leadership. And for the kickoff, let me pass the word to you, Jono. Like, what is the community leadership? How is it different from everything else? How do you see this field?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks, Dan, and it's great to meet everybody here today. Before I go on, I just want to offer a small caveat. I literally just moved house. So there's people running around in the background fixing pipes and electrical outlets and stuff like that. So if there's a bit of background noise, my apologies for that. To me, I have a very small brain, and I have to look at the zoomed out view of things and then keep zooming in. And to me, I look at it like, what is the value of building communities? And I just think that when people work together and they collaborate, not only do you get better results because you get different ideas, different perspectives. A good example of this is, you know, look at the difference between any solo album and any band. Like the band is always better than the solo album because it's one person on a solo album typically. But then the act of collaborating, I think, is more rewarding for people as well. People just enjoy spending time with other people and building interesting things. So to me, there's a huge amount of potential here. I think to make communities happen, the way I've always looked at it is if you take 100 people, I think, and this is not backed by any real scientific rigor, but I think if you take 100 people, generally about 10 of those people will do the majority of the work that the other 90 will consume. And I'm sure each of you will see this in your own communities. And then 1 in every 100 people is just a real leader. They're the kind of people who everybody knows by name, where they're not just doing work, but they're actually facilitating, building, and engaging in a thriving community. And that 1 in every 100, I think it takes a variety of different approaches to kind of foster and facilitate those people. Because in many cases, those folks don't necessarily know that they're leaders, but they're just naturally motivated and doing the right kind of things. And I tend to, from a broad level, I tend to break it into a few different areas. One is, how do you actually build a community that's simple for people to participate in and join? And then the other area is, how do you then incentivize and reward people for actually doing good stuff? And we can delve into both of those different areas, obviously, in this call. So,
awesome. Thank you for this quick overview. And one thing I noticed was that you said like it's about like 2 things: how do you build a community, and how do you incentivize people to be happy in the community and be active. And I like that you don't distinguish between the organizers, the leaders, the members. Like the community, it's all people together, right? So like we want the organizers to be happy by doing some activity, the members be happy by doing some activity. So I feel like in this, so maybe in like what you did not say, I see some community wisdom for myself, sort of like to see the community leadership as the art of entrepreneur, like leading people, right? Like not making the distinctions. So with that, let's jump to the questions. Also, like a reminder for the people watching us live, here are the questions for people on YouTube. Why don't you put your question in the comment in this YouTube video, and we'll pass it to Jono, and let's see if we can get it answered later. So on the Slido, the top question is from Lupe from GDG La Paz. Hi. Says Lupe, nice to meet you. I'm from Bolivia. How do you think we should manage our engagement with our teams? And I'm assuming that Lupe means the organizer teams in the chapters.
Great. Well, nice to meet you too, Lupe. I think there's a few different approaches to this. My view is one of the challenges with, I think, building communities is there are a million different screws that you can stick a screwdriver in and turn, right? You can do meetups, you can create content, you can organize, campaigns, you can do social media, you can do all kinds of different things. So the question I think often turns to not so much what can we do, but what are the most effective things that we can do? And the approach that I always like to take here is to be somewhat strategic in how you do that. So, it's as simple as like, build a plan and stick to it and measure it and see if it works. So from a broad perspective, I break it down into a couple of different areas. The first thing I would suggest here is build a very clear on-ramp for your community. So like how do people, this is more like the interface for how people join. So like the way I tend to look at it is you've got someone out there who is interested in your community, in joining your community. And then there are a set of steps that need to happen between them discovering your community and them actually doing something of value that's valuable to the community as well as to them. So I'll give you an example in a software context. I work with a lot of software companies. That step one of that on-ramp is going to be discover that you can actually do something. Step two is going to be setting up your tool chain. Step three is going to be learning the skills to actually write software. Step four is going to be knowing what to work on, knowing which bugs to fix, knowing which features need building. Step five is getting help when you get stuck, and step six is then receiving some kind of validation when you've made that first contribution. Most of the steps on that on-ramp are the same for any community. Like every community, you need to discover how you can do something, how you can build something of value. Every community, you need to learn the skills to do that. Every community, you need to be able to ask questions and find help. So what I tend to recommend is, build that on-ramp, first of all, for the different kinds of people you want to attract, and use that as kind of a lens in which to determine what work you need to do. So for example, in, excuse me, in pretty much all of those on-ramps, there'll be get help. Like how do people ask questions and get help? So that then means that you then think about, well, okay, well, how do we do this? Do we have a Google group? Do we have a forum? Do we have a regular webinar where people can ask questions, where they can use something such as, like this app that we're using here today for asking questions. So look at each of those different elements and then fill in the gaps for what do we need to do this? Like, the get help piece. How do we, like, what documentation do we need? Like, what are the most critical areas that people are getting stuck? And then what you do is you measure people bouncing from one step to the other, because then you can identify on that on-ramp where people are getting stuck. So if everyone's getting stuck at step 3, which is, learning what to do, like learning the skills to participate, then you know that we need to do something with our documentation, or we need to improve how people are trained or whatever, that kind of thing. So that's one of the first things I would do, is look at your on-ramps, first of all, because a lot of people in the community, I run an event called the Community Leadership Summit each year, which takes place before the OSCON conference. It's going to be happening later this year. I'd go and check it out, communityleadershipsummit.com if you're interested. Completely free to go to. One of the things I notice each time we run this, and there's a couple hundred community managers show up, is everybody talks about social media and, building promotional awareness, doing talks at conferences, doing events. But to me, like, if you go out there and do all that work and get people interested, and then they join you, they get to that first part of the on-ramp, the discover phase, and then they get stuck, it means that you're doing all this promotional work, but they can't actually get involved and do something. And the fundamental premise here is that, and it is building a community around people actually doing stuff, whether that's writing documentation or advocacy or building software or, you know, translating things, whatever it might be. It's about people being active, because that to me is the only way in which people want to stick around, is if they feel like they can do something, it's validated by their peers, and they feel like it adds value to the general community. So I'd first of all absolutely focus on that on-ramp piece. The one thing, and then I'll stop, this is the world's longest answer, and then then there's the engagement piece. Like, how do you keep people interested and keep people participating? The key thing in my mind there is, I tend to think of people joining a community as it's a journey. Like, when you're brand new in a community, when you're brand new in a community, it's nerve-wracking, right? You don't really know anybody. You don't really want to kind of look silly, and there'll be a lot of imposter syndrome and insecurity kind of rolling around in your head. So when people are new, you want to provide them with a lot of validation, a lot of mentoring and guidance. But then when they become regulars, what's more important there is that they're able to do stuff without any kind of bureaucracy getting in the way. And then eventually they'll get to become leaders, where they become those people that everybody knows, everybody references as just, you know, doing great work. So again, I would segment your engagement piece into those three areas: new, regular, and leaders, and think about what are the things that we can do for each of those phases, and absolutely focus on the new phase first of all, and then focus on the regular phase, because your leaders will naturally tend to know what to do. But for people who are new, I see this all the time, and part of the reason why we get to that 10 in 100 is because I think people join a community and then they don't really know what to do. They get a bit stuck, so therefore they never proceed into doing lots of work. So the naturally motivated people tend to end up becoming one of those 10 people in every 100. So the more we provide that guidance, the more we could stretch that 10 to 20 people in the 100, or to 30 people in the 100. That's how I tend to think of it.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So again, I like your sort of entry point coming from the open source world, where everybody is kind of like equal, and making it community leader or like your team, as Lupe asked, basically means like the most active people, or who found like the biggest contribution. So I really like how you look at it. The way to engage your teams is basically to let them be active and see who takes up on the challenge and becomes most active, meaning leader. We will get to another question from Slido. Hopefully you can see my screen. Here is the link to giving your questions. It's bit.ly/cmgtalk.jono. Notice it's caps sensitive, so you need to write it as it is here. So we'll take one more question from Slido, and then anybody here on the call, feel free to step in with your question. So Gabor asks, how do you make your community more appealing to people from another city, so they feel it's worth the time travel, meaning like it can be like 2-hour commute, to just like 1 hour long meetup? How do we make this?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think I think what's really interesting about the GDG community is that there's a local component to this, right? Like there's this kind of like homogenous online community world that a lot of people focus on. But I think there is a lot of value in local communities and making them distinctive. When I was at Canonical, we set up the Ubuntu Loco teams, these local user groups all over the world, and we had about 160, 170 of them. And we got this question all the time, like, if you have a number of groups in a similar geographic region, like why would people travel to? And my view is fairly simple here: is they've got to be distinctive. I think again at a zoomed out level, I think now more than ever there is a fight going on for people's attention, right? So technology has become cheaper, content has become more ubiquitous and more available. The internet has become much more pervasive in people's lives, so it's easier than ever to reach people, but it's harder than ever to sustain their attention. You know, and the advent of social media has given us shorter and shorter attention spans. So to me, the answer to this question is you've got to make sure that your group is really distinctive and different, that people want to travel because there's something new there. To give you an example, when I started out in my kind of journey into building communities, I went to university when I was 19 in a very boring town in England called Wolverhampton. And I was just getting interested in Linux at the time, and I set up a Linux user group there called the Wolverhampton Linux User Group, pretty obviously. And a lot of the Linux user groups back then were, you know, you go and sit in a university lecture hall and you have a couple of talks, and people sit around and they, you know, they drink coffee out of little cardboard cups, and it was all a bit boring. And I wanted the group to be different. So I held our meetings in a pub, and people had a few beers and had some dinner. And it was a very loose and social group. We didn't have talks. We did once a month, sometimes have talks, but it was a very social environment. And what happened is that people started coming to the group from all over the UK because it was different. I don't think it was necessarily better than any of the others, and not everybody liked it. Some people prefer the more formal environment, but it was different, it was distinctive. And I would look at your own group and say, what can we do that differentiates from the others? If you're just doing the same stuff that everybody else is doing, you'll only ever attract a local audience, I think. And that could be, it could be the not just the content that you have, like you could have a certain type of content that's much more unique and relevant. You could, for example, to give you some practical examples, you could be organizing hackathons. You could be having kind of like unconference type content, which is, I found to be works really well. You could have particularly interesting guest speakers. You know, you could have thematic sessions. You know, I'm a big fan of having like certain themes and certain weeks, you know, each month. Or it could be the atmosphere. It could be, yeah, we want to be way more social, or we want to be a bit more formal. You know, that to me is the most important thing that will get people to travel. Oh, and one final thing I would say is content is king. Like the thing with groups in particular, I think in-person physical meetings is very few people will go to a meeting just because the meeting's happening. Most people will go because the content's interesting. So if you've got crappy content, no one's going to go. So the more interesting and relevant, and the more in advance you promote that content, like, you know, if there's going to be something interesting happening 2 hours away from me or an hour and a half from me, it's got to be A, really interesting for me to warrant the drive, and B, I've got to know about it a week and a half, 2 weeks beforehand, because I need to make sure that my wife can be home to take care of my son so I can drive out to it, for example. So content, atmosphere, and promotion, I'd say, are the key things.
Awesome, thank you. And we have an answer here. So now, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for you. So anybody, feel free to unmute and shoot your question. Otherwise, I will do mine, and you don't want that. So, any question? We have people from GDGs, we have people from developer communities other than GDGs. I see some very senior people. I see some people I don't know. What's your question about managing chapters, doing engaging events, leading teams? So anyone, feel free to unmute yourself and go for it.
Hello.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, this is Pritesh here from JDG Paris. I have one question. For the organizer, what is the best strategy to make decision in terms of the roadmap or events or tech fest, or like to be like the issue is we are unable to find the common time where everyone can join us and everyone is available, and that's the result that we need to wait a lot to do any progress or any decision on some stuff. And what do you suggest in such a situation? What could be the best practice in order to do progress, even if not everyone is present? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pritesh. It's a great question. So how do you most effectively make decisions and map out roadmaps and stuff like that for a group? I think we can break this into two areas. The first one is going to be the decision-making piece, like who gets to make decisions and how are they made? And then the second area is going to be how do we formulate a set of decisions for that person or that group of people to make? So let's maybe start out with the who makes the decision piece. My view here is unopinionated communities generally fail. Like if you've got a community group where no one is really kind of recognized as the decision-making authority or a group of people, then it will basically, the community will fail because it won't be able to do anything. And communities that are inactive, that don't make decisions, that just chat on mailing lists won't get anywhere. So there are two approaches to this. One is that you have a dictator, so one person who makes a decision, and dictatorial communities often work reasonably well. The other option is that you have a group of people who have a vote. So you may have, let's say, 5 people in your community or 3 people in your community. You have a meeting, somebody, a decision is proposed, and those people have a vote, and the majority wins. And you can blast through 8, 10, 12 decisions, and off you go. The thing that's nice about that kind of group voting approach is that the community can feel like it's really representative of a broader set of people. Like if you have one person and a lot of people really disagree with that one person, then some people feel like it's very limited if that person doesn't represent the interest of the community. So the first thing I would do is I'd firm up that, and whatever you decide for that is going to be unpopular with some of your members. There's going to be some people who will not be happy with either the one person who makes decisions or the group of people who make decisions, but that's just the way communities tend to operate. The second thing I would to think about here is the cadence in which you make those decisions, in which you formulate things. This is an area where I see a lot of waste in communities, where decisions are kind of made on a fairly ad hoc basis. And that's okay for doing small things, but for making big changes, for working on big initiatives, sometimes it's a problem. The method that I found to be very effective, and one that I use with pretty much all of my clients, and something that we really does, a lot of this came out of my time at Canonical, is where you basically have a regular cadence around roadmaps. So you say, okay, let's say we're going to build a roadmap for Q2 and Q3, so 6-month period. And at the beginning of that 6-month period, you ask everybody to go and maybe into a Google Doc to go and fill in a bunch of ideas, the things that they want to work on. And then what you do is you go through a process of firming up, okay, based upon those ideas, what are the things that we actually want to work on? Who's going to work on them? And when should it be ready? And I like to track all of this in a Google spreadsheet. You can have like list of items, what should be delivered for each item, who's going to be doing it. And I tend to break that into who owns that particular item, who needs to be involved, and then who needs to be notified when it's completed, and then the status. And you just have a weekly meeting with your community. Okay, what's the progress on this? What's the progress on this? What's the progress on this? And what happens is the benefit of that kind of regular cadence, and it could be 6 months, it could be 3 months, it could be 1 week if you wanted it to be, is that at the beginning of putting that roadmap together, everybody starts thinking about what do we need to work on. And then towards the end, everybody gets to celebrate. You get to say, we all did this. And that's incredibly powerful. When I was at Canonical, we did this with Ubuntu. Every 6 months, we'd issue a new release of Ubuntu, which is an operating system. So when we got to the end of a release cycle, everybody was tired and celebrated what we did. And there was champagne was poured and all the rest of it. But then there was the excitement of thinking, well, what do we want to do in the next 6 months? And everybody started getting into that creative mindset. So I would recommend as a starting point, maybe just map out, getting towards the end of Q1, maybe start with your community, figure out who are going to be the decision makers, like I mentioned earlier, and then just map out a set of things for Q2. Everybody puts together their ideas about, maybe the process could be formulate a proposal for who's going to work on what and what we're going to do and who's going to do the work. And then they present it to the people who make the decisions or the person who makes the decision, and then blast through it in one meeting, and then you've got a plan. And then what you do is do that first cycle, let's say it's Q2, and then review it, see how well it worked, see what you could improve, see what didn't work very well, because the first time you do it, it will be mostly terrible. And then improve it, refine it. And once you've done that 2 or 3 times, you'll get it down to a science. And I found that to be an incredibly valuable way of working.
Sounds like a definitely interesting inspiration. So I'm curious if any of you will try it out. Definitely let us know. Any other question from the crowd here before we go back to Slido? The link for that is here. But before we go there, questions from people here, please unmute yourself.
I'm Shivan from GDG question.
Yes, go for it.
So I would like to know about the tools which community managers can use to increase the productivity in terms of community managing. Basically, the tools which, rather than the Google spreadsheets, is there any tools which we can use to increase the productivity in organizing and doing stuff?
I'm terribly sorry, Mohammed, but my line broke up there. I'm not sure if you folks can still hear me, but I didn't. The question kind of broke up there. Could you repeat?
Okay, I'll repeat it once again. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. You may want to speak up a little bit and a little bit slower because the connection is pretty bad from your side.
All right, all right. So I just want to know the tools which we, as a community manager, the tools which we can use to increase our productivity. So basically, we usually used to have like Google spreadsheet as of now. So this year we had like planned our complete 2018 plans using Trello. So is there any tools like this?
Yeah. So the question is, what other tools can we use as community managers to achieve some of the things, Jono, you were mentioning?
Which tools to use? Okay. There's a couple of tools which I think tooling is very much a personal choice. Everybody approaches tools differently, and I would figure out the workflow first, and then pick the tools to serve the workflow, as opposed to picking the tools first and then wrapping the workflow around it. I've become a real big fan of using Google Docs for this kind of stuff. So I tend to use a lot of spreadsheets, and I tend to use a lot of Google Documents, primarily because I think it's just a fantastic way of people being able to collaborate around documents or content. I used to use Google Documents for managing a lot of kind of planning around this kind of works, around the planning pieces. But I found spreadsheets to be a way better way of doing that, because you can delete rows, you can move them around. So I would definitely, for a strategic, like organizational stuff, tend to use something like spreadsheets. And then of course there's a ton of other tools for how you manage other elements. So just to walk through some of the things that I use, which might be food for thought. So kind of my task list of managing what I need to do, I work with at any one time usually 4 to 8 clients, and then I tend to use Trello, which I'm a big fan of for just managing those task lists. And I love the Kanban approach for being able to have a card and then moving it into different columns based upon the status. In terms of social media, I tend to use Buffer for lining a load of stuff up. And I use Twitter, G+, LinkedIn, and Instagram for a bunch of that kind of stuff. For communication platforms, the go-to that I have in terms of building communities is, I'm a huge fan of Discourse, which is a forum. Discourse is incredibly powerful for a number of different reasons. First of all, I think it's the best forum tool out there. but also it's got fantastic tools built into it for things such as tracking how active people are in the forum. It's got this concept inside of it called trust levels, where everyone starts out at trust level 0 because they're brand new and they haven't really done anything, and then they spin up to trust level 1, they go up to trust level 2, they go up to trust level 3, based upon how much they post, how much they read, how much their content is like, things such as that. So Discourse I found to be a really powerful tool for like the hub of your community. And there's a ton of like plugins and functionality that map into that as well. And then I guess the only other thing I would say is I've become a real fan of WordPress for kind of building out community websites, just because it's so extensible, both in terms of dynamic content such as blogging, but also static content such as web pages for building the structure of your site, things such as that. So, but again, I would look at the workflow first and then look at which tools serve that workflow. As a general rule of thumb, I'm definitely one for A, open source tools where possible, and B, tools that have an inherent collaborative component. That's one of the reasons why I'm such a fan of using Google Docs. Mm-hmm. It's really easy for people to actually collaborate together and share their input and review and shape content into a final form.
Yeah, and I can definitely second that. That it's not so much about a tool, but what you really need to do. And in the community and event world, sometimes the speed and ease of access is crucial. And so without necessarily going to details, because you folks would roast me on Twitter, I can say that some of the largest Google events that happen around the world are managed in Google spreadsheets, like one huge spreadsheet with like many tabs below. But you would be quite surprised to see what kind of events were managed in a spreadsheet like this, because the universal accessibility is really the key. Yeah. So let's go. Yeah, Jono.
One of the final thing I just wanted to share as well, and this is actually one thing that I've become a real fan of recently as well is easy and effective ways of gluing these pieces together. So I've become a fan of this service called Zapier, which is a commercial service, but they have like a free plan. But you can do this using APIs, where you can say, for example, when I receive an email from a certain address in Gmail, what it does is it will then go and create a folder in Google Drive, and it will add it'll move some documents in there, and then it might create an entry in ProsperWorks. Like Zapier allows you to kind of glue together these different services, and that kind of automation piece can be very, very helpful as well for a bunch of particularly onboarding communities as well. So
awesome. So let's switch back to Slido. We have 2 more questions on Slido. So think of your questions, because you'll definitely have room for more. So there are 2 very much linked questions together by Gabor. They are about attendees and visitors on the physical meetup. So one question says, what do you consider average, good, great turnout for a meetup? And the related question is, should you set a limit for maximum number of attendees, even if the venue could accept more people? Will the fear of missing out increase the number of attendees? So, Jono, what do you think? Meetup attendee numbers versus what's good, what's bad?
Yeah, it's a good question. I actually don't think, I mean, I would love to be able to give everyone here my take on specific numbers, but I don't think that it's feasible to do that, because I think it's really heavily dependent on the area and the content that you've got. Like if you have a meetup or a group meeting, you know, in a rural area, getting 10 people to that group is a huge turnout. But if you have a group in the middle of San Francisco, probably not so much. Likewise, if you have a very, very specialist topic, you know, if you've got a very specialist area of quantum mechanics, you're probably going to only attract a very limited number of people. So as a general rule, the general feeling I have here is when I'm organizing kind of meetups or events, I want it to feel busy. And that, again, is somewhat dependent on the size of the room. So, you know, if you have a little room in in somebody's house or in a pub or in a office somewhere that can seat 20 people, and you have a meetup and 10 people, 15 people show up and it feels busy, then that is the outcome that you want. You want the atmosphere to feel dynamic. I think people don't like going to, kind of like meetups that don't feel active and interesting and dynamic, that feel kind of, drafty and empty and all the rest of it. And the more people show up to a meeting, the more busy it feels, it also loosens people up. People are more willing to talk and all the rest of it. If you've got 10 people sat in the middle of a room that can seat 100, people will feel very awkward and they won't want to communicate with each other. Everyone will be aware of the size of the room. So I would think about how likely is the content that you're preparing to, how many people is it likely to attract, and then choose a venue where appropriate for that, if you've got the freedom to do so. So if you have one venue and it seats 30 people, for example, I would stay away from content that you think will only attract a few people, because it will feel empty and weird. Whereas you ideally want people to be wanting to go there on a regular basis, and for you to have content that is of general interest. So I would actually just survey your attendees and say, well, what's the kind of stuff that you're interested in? I'm of the view, one thing I've learned across my career is all of the answers to how we build communities, how we do anything, how we build great products is wrapped up in the minds of your audience. You just need to figure out how to get it out of there. So if you've got, let's say, 50 people in your group, they all know what they love to watch, what interests them, what kind of engagement that they like. They will never tell you voluntarily. Like, never depend on people to say, well, people will tell me what's interesting. They won't. So you've got to kind of coax that information out of them. So I wish I had a better answer. I wish I could say like this number, but I think it really does depend on those different attributes.
Yeah, I was a little bit scared, John. I will say like the ideal number is 20, and half of the meetups I ever did, like I would feel bad about them because they did not have 20. So yeah, there's definitely not an ideal number. So it depends on the context, as Jono says. There was also the question about like how to maybe create or prevent, I don't know, the fear of missing out. Like, John, I don't know like how easily this question can be translated, but how can we make like the message about the event so powerful that people will start thinking, oh my God, I have to be here. I just can't miss that.
It's a great question. The fear of missing out is a really powerful force. I remember a few years ago, this conference I go to every year, OSCON, where we do the Community Leadership Summit. My son, he was 3 at the time, got strep throat, and I had to fly home on the first day of the conference. And of course, it was the right thing to do, because I love my son and I want him to be okay. But until that conference ended, I was just bummed out the entire time. I think the way in which we do this is, when I think about events, to me, there are 2 major components in every event. There is the content that's interesting. And I think as a general rule, if people miss out on content, that's okay. They'll be a bit annoyed about it. If an interesting speaker comes to town and you miss it, you'll get over it. I think where the fear of missing out really lies is when you feel like you're missing out on the social networking piece. It's the hanging out with people who you really enjoy spending time with, or the people you want to be with, and missing that. So to me, the way in which we engineer that FOMO is promoting, is sharing what happened after the event. To me, there's a promotional component before you run an event where you promote it and the content and what's going to be happening. But then the event recap is certainly as important, if not more important. So like posting a recap of this is what we did with lots of pictures of speakers and people hanging out and talking and whatever else. That is really important, because then the people who haven't been to the event yet will be able to see, oh, well, that looks kind of it looks accessible and engaging and interesting. I think a lot of people, particularly people who are not necessarily as familiar with communities who are new at this, going to an event or a meetup for the first time is pretty scary. Like I said earlier on about the new part of the new regular and leaders. So seeing pictures of that makes things a lot easier. This is particularly important, I'd say, for people who are in like a minority group. So, as an example, it's getting better, but for a long time, there was a pretty shockingly low number of women in technology. And if you see pictures of an event, of a tech event, and there's a bunch of women there, if you're a woman, it's probably going to be a little bit easier for you to consider going through it. So I definitely do that, and I think that will help.
So before I move to the question on Slido, does anybody here on the call have a question that you would like to give Jono directly, either based on what we discussed or some issue you are facing in your community? Again, the floor is open, so feel free to unmute yourself and step in.
Hi guys, I'm Gabor from Budapest. First of all, thanks for answering my questions. And I have another one which is related to building a team of contributors to the community. What personality traits should I look for who can be a future contributor? Like, who needs that little push to be more active, and who should I focus my time on? Thank you.
A great question. When you say contributor, are you talking about, what kind of things are you thinking about? Can you give me an example of what kind of contribution?
Like helping with the organization, or just, I don't know, preparing a presentation.
Got it. Perfect. So what I would suggest here, there's a few different pieces I would think about. First of all, I would sit down and design, and this you can do this in less than 30 minutes, but think about what personas you want to attract in terms of different types of contribution. Like, do you want organizers? Do you want developers building software? Do you want people producing, documentation, doing translations, that kind of thing? Then you can prioritize which of the kinds of types of contribution are most important to you. That's one element. But the second thing is, in terms of what to look for, I would look for initially fairly self-motivated individuals. So where you see people who naturally just kind of take the mantle and run with it, those are the people you want to foster. Now, this is, I think, a tricky thing with a lot of communities is there are certain people who are just naturally self-motivated and they just naturally do good work. And those are the people you absolutely want to foster and make sure that they feel empowered and they can do good work, because they will just naturally do stuff, right? So they don't need a lot of hand-holding to kind of deliver great content. So where you see instances of people just naturally being more responsive in discussions, or naturally producing content, or creating, additional material, definitely focus on those people first. The other area is then people who you think have got the potential, but they need help getting going. They need like the engine kickstarting. And the challenge there is it can sometimes be difficult to determine which people are going to be receptive to that. Like, some people, you can give them all of the help and the mentoring and the encouragement in the world, and they just won't do it because they to put it bluntly, there are certain people who are just much more motivated naturally than other people. And if you spend all of your time trying to get the unmotivated people motivated, you won't see a lot of results. So I look for signs of natural interest and motivation, people doing things of their own free will, as opposed to being coaxed into it. You can get other people doing that stuff, but I'd start there. And if you the way to do that is to look at all of the ways in which people communicate with each other, and look at the people who are the most active, the people who are the most dynamic, the people who come up with the most ideas and create, not necessarily the most ideas, but the people who are most interested in actually executing ideas. And I think you'll find those people naturally pop up to the surface.
Awesome. You have time for one question here from the crowd, and and then I will move to one question which is still unanswered on the slide. So, guys and girls, anybody want to take the last live question? Okay, maybe we'll take your live question after the Slido question. So the question is from Philip, who is here with us on the call. How do you provide motivation, new challenges for a community that has been active for 10 years? How do you motivate the community leaders, the organizers?
That is such a great question. This was something I experienced when I was running the Ubuntu community team. I'll be honest with you, it's tricky because when you've had a community that's been running for that long, there'll be people who will be very much open and enthusiastic about change, and there'll be people who absolutely resist change. And I'm pretty sure that that Philip has probably experienced some of that already. I think there's a couple of thoughts there. One is that I think communities that don't regularly reinvent themselves and challenge themselves, they become stale. So if you have a community that basically never changes, people will just get bored and they'll move on. And there'll be a very small number of people who will love the fact that it is the same all of the time and they'll stick around, but you will lack the dynamism that makes communities so special. So that kind of gets back to the question earlier on about how do you make decisions. And sometimes, you know, in keeping people motivated and keeping people interested, it means moving in a slightly different direction and choosing areas that are relevant and interesting today that maybe weren't interesting 5 years ago. And that means making unpopular choices. And that's where having like a group of people who make the decisions can be helpful, as opposed to one person who unilaterally decides to change the direction. So to me, the first question here is, when assessing this, is always saying, like, how do we add value? Like, what is the value that we're creating here? So if you have a community that's been going for a little while, look at the value that you've created over the last 10 years and say, like, what is the value that we've produced, but what is the value that we haven't produced yet? Like, what are the things that we could do that we haven't done that will be really useful in what we're trying to do here? And that could be supporting different types of material or content or topic areas. And then at that point, start bouncing some ideas around in your community and say, like, and I'm a big believer here of just being completely open about it. Just say, look, we've been going for 10 years now, or 5, 10 years. We feel like it's time for us to refresh our mission. Let's get creative. Let's think of some ideas. And some people will come out with some wacky ideas. And some people will have some less wacky ideas. And then just start bouncing some of those ideas around. And you'll start to see what generates the most general interest. And then I would dip your toes into experimenting with a couple of those new areas of focus. And I think what will happen is you'll start energizing people in the group that haven't necessarily been particularly energized before. So one approach is that, which is I think, you know, there's this kind of cliche term of thinking outside of the box, but it really is like saying, let's throw out all preconceived notions about what we do. Let's assume you have a group that only does meetups. They don't do anything else. Well, one area in which you could add value is, well, why don't we build a content portal for this group of people? Or why don't we start translating material? Or why don't we build a software platform or a software product? You know, throw all preconceived notions away and see what starts interesting people. And some people will not be interested in certain areas. The other thing here as well, at a more general level, is fostering a culture where people can be creative in how they solve problems, like so, and how they propose things. So this is something I see all the time in relation to tooling, where again, to use Ubuntu as an example, historically people would use IRC as a communication platform. And then a bunch of people would kind of come forward and say, well, why don't we think about using Slack or HipChat or something else? And the initial reaction will be, well, we can't do that. We've always used IRC. And I think it's imperative that leaders say, no, asking the question of should we use something else is a good question to ask. Like, we shouldn't immediately jump to, we can't do that because we've always done it this other way. So keeping things fresh is going to be a certain element of protecting creative ideas around that stuff as well. And I think if you, again, subscribe to that method that I mentioned earlier on about, you know, mapping work out into a quarter and coming up with ideas and mapping it into that central sacred plan that everybody will work from for that quarter, that tracks what you're going to work on, who's going to do it. That then gives you, when people have those creative ideas and they think outside the box and you put it into that plan, you can then see which things work and which things don't work. And I think that will deliver some good results.
So Jono, from what you said, how much of that can be applied to those of you who are here from GDGs? You know that GDGs have been around for 10 years as well. It's 11th year. And Jono, you had seen quite a bit of the GDG work, like from your collaboration with us. So like, what do you see as some of the challenges for the maybe next 10 years for GDG, Good Developer Group as a movement? And I guess like any other community who's just been around for 10 years, but let's focus on GDGs now with your knowledge of Good Developer Groups.
Yeah, and the caveat here is I obviously have nowhere near as much experience of GDGs as everyone who's watching this. But the thing that excites me about GDGs is I think first of all, there's already a thriving community, which I think is fantastic. I would say that there are a couple of things that I've observed. I think with any community that's been going for a while, there is that risk of becoming stale. So I think identifying areas in individual groups where people can explore new and different areas is always important to foster. And some groups will do that and some groups won't. At a higher level, how people such as yourself, Dan, and others can kind of refresh the opportunities that people can focus on across the wider community. So, you know, running interesting campaigns and focus and these different areas, like broadening and diversifying the focus of GDGs, I think is going to be really important. Because if it's just like, let's just keep things rolling and we don't do that, then they'll become stale. I think the other element here is going to be scaling up decision-making in an objective way. I think governance is really important in communities, and governance done in an efficient and an elegant way. So to give you an example, when I joined Canonical, we had a community council, which was a group of people who made decisions on behalf of the community, and we had a technical board. And as the community grew into hundreds of thousands of people, that just didn't cut it, right? And similar to GDGs, Canonical is a company behind it. Google is a company that's very involved in the GDG movement. So having a governance infrastructure that that is independent, where you've got community members making decisions, where you've got kind of an electoral process in which how people can participate, I think is really important, because I think what it does is it really makes sure that you have a nice balance between the company and the participants, and make sure that the best people are making the decisions. And then how you scale it out. Like when we scaled it out in Ubuntu, you know, we ended up having a number of different sub-councils that focused on, you know, communications platforms or certain regions of the world. And I think that will be a good area to focus on, a good area to think about moving forward, is what does governance look like? And what's the most effective way in which you can be productive with that, but also independent with that as well? So.
Awesome. So thanks, Jono, for those almost last words. And yeah, I think these areas of the, let's say, rejuvenation of the content or approaches, and also like looking at how we organize ourselves as GDG, that's definitely the conversations that we are having recently, and we will be having them. So those of you who are GDGs, definitely join us on all the summits and meetups where we chat with each other, and let's see what we can do together to move GDG forward in the direction which brings us next 10 years. I think we have time for maybe some last words or last questions also here from you, ladies and gentlemen, on the call. So if you have a burning question that you want to shout at Jono before he runs away to his relocation projects, now is the time. So feel free to step in, unmute yourself, and any comment, question, clarification, we still have a couple minutes for that. Okay, looks like we provided enough food for thought. So thank you, Jono, very much for joining us.
No, thank you.
As usual. Keep an eye on Jono. Jono, what's your Twitter account? Is it Jono Bacon, or what's your Twitter handle?
My Twitter handle is Jono Bacon, JONOBAC.
Jono Bacon. So he posts regular, interesting things. He does interviews like this every so often, so you may want to follow up on in other program. Also, keep checking the community groups offerings, which is both for GDGs and the standard member of the community groups, coming from all kinds of developer communities. We have recordings of the past calls. We will be posting the recording of this call as well. Next month, we'll have another topic, maybe another guest. So keep with us. Again, the address on YouTube, you can see it on the upper corner. For the people on the live call, it's as usual, g.co/dev/community groups. If you just Google out community groups program, it will show up. Thank you very much for joining us. All the best with your communities, and see you guys and girls around.